Equity Fellow, along with some of my other colleagues that you've met today, and I'm also a 60-year PhD candidate in public policy and sociology. So today, along with my colleague Reshma Nargan, we are facilitating this panel around community-engaged research and best practices. So we thought this followed really nicely from this morning's panel, where we're talking about kind of understandings of justice and equality and what that means across the disciplines. So we wanted to follow that up with some practical experience. So what folks are actually doing with community engaged research on the ground and what best practices for implementing these types of projects are. So I will briefly introduce you to our panel, but we'll have them tell you a little bit more about themselves and their work shortly. So first, Reshma, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Reshma Nargund. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at the Nicholas School of the Environment, and I look at the effects of exposures during pregnancy on the newborn's gene expression. So how do very early life exposures affect lifelong trajectories? Thank you.
Awesome. So first up, we have Dr. Charles Muiruri. Dr. Muiruri is a health services researcher, assistant professor at the Duke Department of Population Health Sciences, assistant research professor in the Global Health Institute, and adjunct lecturer at Kilimanjaro Christian Medical University College in Moshi, Tanzania. Next, we have Dr. Mina Silberberg. Dr. Silberberg is an associate professor in the Duke Department of Family Medicine and Community Health and vice chief for research and evaluation in the Division of Community Health. Next, we have Dr. Mina Smith. Dr. Mina Smith is the Associate Dean of the College of Health Sciences and also Associate Professor of Human Sciences at North Carolina Central University. And then finally, we have Ruth Wygle, PhD candidate, who is a sixth-year PhD candidate in sociology here at Duke University.
Thank you, Adrienne. So let's get started with the panel. And we want to know a little bit more about your work and who you are, but I want to couch it in today's theme. So what about your personal and professional trajectories led you to get involved in community engaged research? We can just go in the order that we're seated. Thank you.
Again, I'm Charles Muiruri. Your question was how my personal and journey to community health?
Your personal and professional journey, like what motivated you to get involved in community engaged research?
So I don't know if it's motivation or it just happened. So I'm a sixth born of a house of 9. I have 6 brothers. So maybe I came from a community first, right? And then my work in global health sends me to Tanzania in my very early work here at Duke, not as a faculty member, but as an administrator. The goal is to develop a research site in Tanzania. And so I arrived there with all this knowledge about what to do in clinical research, and I realized I'm actually dealing with people, and I'm actually dealing with people who actually have their own interests. And so I came to learn about this thing called locally relevant research. So there's great things that we need to do in the world, but there's something that's local, that's very important to the community for which they want to spend their time on. So I got to understand about local relevance. Local relevance brought all these pieces of the community to which then we were going to figure out how do we have our own academic exercise at the same time really serve the community. So I came to by accident, not necessarily by being motivated to do community health, but just understanding that we are dealing with communities and that local relevance of what we were doing was going to be important.
Thank you.
I've been thinking about this question a little bit since we had our pre-panel meeting, and I realized that there actually are a number of times in my life that I was thinking about, saying things about, or even doing things about community engagement without having the language to call it that. But telling the story in a more chronological way, I was a community organizer for a year and a half, first in New York and then in the Dominican Republic before I went to graduate school. And I think that experience very much influenced some of the ways I thought about the work I was doing in grad school, and I always was really, really interested in the application of research to, real life situations. I think basic research, theory-driven research is all super exciting and wonderful, but what made me want to get up in the morning was kind of the idea of that. So that led me to program evaluation, which in some senses is sort of intrinsically community engaged, because by definition, when you're evaluating a program, you are answering a question that is of interest to people involved with the program, right? The idea isn't just coming out of your head. It's some information that they want in order to make decisions. And that, I came to Duke to the Division of Community Health initially to do program evaluation in the division, and saw this opportunity, that research opportunity that came out of NIH to apply for something called community-based participatory research, and it sounded like a whole lot of stuff that I did and thought about, maybe not with that exact terminology, and I ran and got Sherman James, who some of you here may know or remember. He was in the public policy school at that time. He's a social epidemiologist, and I had seen a presentation he had done on CBPR, and I said, let's do this. And we were lucky enough to get funded, so that was kind of my foray into formal community-based participatory research.
So growing up, I actually lived the experiences of being someone from an underrepresented group. And it was important to me as I got older to give back to my own community and surrounding communities. When I was a master's student at NCCU, the same place that I'm at now, I took a community psychology course, and that again sort of sparked my interest in learning more about community, giving back to community, and brainstorming ways to empower community. That word community kept coming up. Now I am a part of what's called the Community Engagement Corps. It's part of a grant effort at NCCU. And again, we are really about empowering underrepresented communities, particularly rural communities in North Carolina. So that word community has been a recurring theme in my personal life as well as my professional work.
Yeah, I think my experience is quite similar to Dr. Smith and Dr. Silberberg. Growing up, I was pretty medicalized as a child, so I was in and out of a lot of healthcare facilities, and I was at a research hospital and very quickly became involved in the community advisory board and participating in clinical trials and taking surveys and focus groups. And so I think I only ever understood research as community-based and would hear about things like participatory research and patient-centered research in the healthcare setting. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to do when I grew up and thinking about doing research and social science research, I kind of always knew that the experts are the people you're studying, not the people who are doing the studying. My own work now happens in prisons, jails, and reentry facilities, and I think I benefit from constantly working with partners in that work a lot, and so it kind of naturally lends itself to being able to do community research. And it's been nice to be at Duke and be in meetings and say, have we thought about a community advisory board? Have we thought about ways to make this participatory? How are we thinking about expertise? So yeah, it's that.
Thank you. I really liked the answers for this question because there isn't one way to get into community engaged research, and a lot of times it's not intentional, and Dr. Muiruri used the word accidental, so I really wanted that to come through this question, so thank you. So the next question I want to ask is sort of a follow-up question, but it's a follow-up question to a lot of things that we have discussed so far this morning. we've discussed about the ephemeral nature of graduate students who come in and go, but undergraduate students who come in and go. But I'm curious to know, what do you think about some of these aspects in the community itself? Sometimes the communities themselves change. Either it is because the socioeconomic conditions of the communities change, or the people change. There's a different set of people that move in. So I'm curious to know, have you faced that in your work, and how do you deal with that?
Trying to think about what has happened. So over the last probably 15 years, downtown Durham has changed, right? So people we were serving in downtown Durham over 20 years ago is very different right now. Serving as one of the members of the Duke Library, there's this question about how do we engage the communities in the East Campus? And so that question came up, and I said, well, the East Campus right now, the folks who live around there are not people we are trying to tap into. And so in terms of really thinking of what has happened in Durham in itself, maybe makes it close to what you're trying to ask. And then how do we re-engage, and how do we think about it? And so for that question, I actually think of my friend KJ Hill, who sits there, who works as the director of ReCity co-working space that essentially is thinking about Durham from that piece. And can I ask him to say something about ReCity? Because I think he's probably going to answer that question, because Durham has changed with him.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles, for putting me on the spot here. Hopefully I have a good answer. ReCity is a co-working space, about 25 different mission-driven organizations. That's how we describe it. Most of them are nonprofits, but some of them are for-profit businesses as well. But whether nonprofit or for-profit, the goal is to help create a more just community, creating opportunities for everyone. And like some of the answers earlier, ReCity has been serving a lot of the presenting issues, kind of the surface level issues, but not necessarily addressing the underlying root cause issues. And so about a year or so ago, we recognized our need to include our participants and the clients of these nonprofit organizations in the process of determining best ways to serve them. So we've been using liberatory design thinking, which is kind of a pivot from human-centered design thinking and layering in communities rather than just individuals to allow them to participate and help us think through not just how do we help people get jobs or help address healthcare issues, which we need to do and want to continue to do, but how do we also think about the underlying root cause issues that are creating the need for jobs and healthcare and transportation and all the other things. So that's what we're doing at ReCity, recognizing that we have been functioning in some ways for the last several years and been somewhat effective, but in order to really empower the community, we need to include the community, not just in receiving from the organizations, but also be part of planning and processing and be really part of the leadership of it. So hopefully that answers somewhat of the question that you had.
Yeah, thank you. And they're located exactly where a lot of people would go and study disparities in Durham. So if you're a researcher at Duke at that point 10 years ago, you would be going exactly where ReCity is located. And so essentially from your question, if the community has changed, maybe ReCity has a way to reach to that where they've been gentrified and pushed to, they're potentially getting into that. So maybe hopefully that kind of gets closer to the point. But thanks, KJ.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if I've been in the situation where sort of the whole community was changing. I've certainly been in the situation where I was working with people whose individual lives were changing, and in particular, obviously, if you're working with people who are particularly subject to a lot of the challenges that our society can throw at people, then that also becomes part of the story of working with those folks. And I think it's just about open communication and understanding. I've definitely been in the situation, where what you're question first made me think of is where like programs change or priorities change, or and when I first came to the Division of Community Health, I remember Susan Yagi was the division chief at that time, and I was evaluating something for them, and she was telling me about like this huge shift that was happening partway through, which was going to affect my evaluation. And then she looked at me and she said, "Why aren't your eyes like rolling around in your head? Because whenever I tell researchers who want to work with us stuff like this, like they can't handle it. Like they're just, because right, a traditional researcher, it's like, I'm setting out to do this thing. I'm going to collect this data from these people to answer this question, and then right." And again, it's a really different mind shift to say, I'm here to do what's needed, and what's needed might change, right? And it's just a different way of thinking about things.
I don't have a ton to add here, but I will echo what Charles mentioned just about, I can't remember if it was Charles or KJ, following the communities that you were engaged with. So if gentrification occurs, don't let the partnership stop there. Put some sort of measure in place to stay connected with the community and follow them in that way.
I'm a demographer by training, so population changes are something I think about a lot, and at least in my work in the criminal justice space, the justice-involved populations they're getting older and increasingly female. So I think the practitioners and the researchers are definitely having to think about needs and changing spaces. And so, yeah, that's super, super important. I don't know how much this has to do with the populations changing, but it occurs for me too, like population consensus isn't something often that exists, and that could be a result of changing dynamics. But even when we think about like what data we want to collect and how we want to collect that, and there will be support from certain segments of the community. Yes, we give consent to being followed or to participating in this, whereas others, desire more autonomy, they desire a more formal consent process. So I think having some way to kind of like constantly surveil who is in the community you're serving and recognizing that it might not be the people you've been building relationships with 5 or 10 years with is super important.
Thank you.
I don't know if this
go ahead.
adds up, but I'm just thinking about what I do during the day, which is my research work. I focus on cardiovascular diseases among HIV-infected patients, and this is something that's just coming up. We are potentially having some of the old people living long enough to actually have chronic conditions in HIV space. That's changing, right? And so as I go back to that community, the issue is not we can't get HIV drugs, we can get cardiovascular diseases drugs. And so that's changing. And so that has really informed how my research looks like at the moment, even though early on with Kevin, we started with focusing on HIV. My current work is really keeping the person living with HIV healthy and longer and in a healthy space. And cardiovascular disease is what I'm focusing on now.
Thank you. So I want to know a little bit more about what are some of the first steps that you take if you want to start a community engaged research program or project, and tell us how it played out in some of the projects that you have led.
Get Mina to say this because I look up to you for that question. Did I go first?
Seriously?
Yeah, I think I listen to Mina a lot in terms of how do you start these things, trust building and understanding. And she's comes from a community person in this space. So I look up to that for that question. I think you have the perfect answer.
Okay, well, thanks for making it impossible for me to live up to that feeling. Thank you, Charles. Well, I'm going to do a shameless plug. One of the things that I do at Duke is I'm the director of the Community Engaged Research Initiative at the Clinical Translational Science Institute, which despite what people may think is here to serve the entire university and the entire Durham community, not just the medical school. A number of folks from my team are actually here today, which is great. And one of the things you can do is you can come to us because we exist to support people in doing community engaged research, people who are interested in it and may not have done it before. So we will give you feedback on your ideas. We will match you with partners. If your community, we'll match you with researchers. If you're a researcher, we'll match you with community folks. We do training, capacity building, all sorts of, we'll do some sort of jump-starting of community engagement for you in a variety of ways. We have folks that we work with that we can connect you with. So that's one thing that you can do, and it's free. But I guess when I look back on my own projects, it's really been about working whatever relationships I already had, right? So when I mentioned the project that we did for NIH with Sherman James, because I was in the Division of Community Health, the division, I was pretty new to Durham, but the people in the division already had a lot of working relationships, right? And so we started, I just, asked the division chief, like, who would you suggest working with on this? Can you introduce me? And so forth. And that's pretty much been the way it's been every time is starting with those existing relationships and then taking it kind of slow.
Told you had the right answer. All right. Mine is very unorthodox, right? Mine is usually, I think about yourself with the talents you have beyond academics. If you have any talent, if you have cooking talents, that's probably the icebreaker for you. KJ and I share one thing. KJ is a former professional soccer player. I happen to play in a low way in soccer, so we connected with KJ in the soccer space. And that's how I get into the community. So we end up working with formerly resettled refugee kids. And in that space, that's where we come to a place of understanding because we're trying to build relationships. So I can't cook that well, but I can play soccer that well. And so we can connect with them. And so I think as tips, it's not to show up with nothing, show up with something that you have. It could be that you like drama, you like those things is starting. And that's your entry point to the community for which they will see you as a human being, not a professor from Duke who's, all tied up. And so you break it down. People like football, fantasy football and things like those. So that's my crazy way of thinking about it. But so far, maybe it's worked.
Trust building, trust building, trust building. Very, very important. And you want to be mindful of who you are sending into the community. Does that person look like the community members? Do they have some sort of shared lived experience? One thing that has been hugely helpful in our efforts is we have a community liaison. We've nicknamed her a gatekeeper, and she's just that. You cannot enter the county that we work in without her approval. She is very protective of her community, rightfully so, because neighboring institutions, we're notorious for coming into communities, getting what we need and never coming back. So that gatekeeper has been really, really instrumental in our efforts in terms of collecting rich data. But once you build that trust, it becomes a mutual partnership, and the community is eager and willing to work with you. So, trust building.
I think a good first step is to define community and to define engaged. So I have worked with a large kind of cross-disciplinary group here at Duke, and we'd been toying with the idea of creating a community advisory board. And we had our initial meeting, and it turned out we did not agree what community meant. So some of us had been envisioning re-entering individuals experiencing incarceration, family members. Others were like, we're going to get all the district attorneys and all of the judges and all of the lawyers. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's also community, but not quite what we'd been thinking. So I think coming to a clear consensus about who you want informing your work, and then the engaged piece of it is similar. Is it, are you just hoping to solicit a survey or, test pilot something? Are you hoping to bring someone on to be a community liaison or a consultant in that work? And are you going to see them as a contractor the way that you might see a research assistant? Are you going to pay them? I think having those kind of clear expectations and being respectful of the fact that you're most likely going to be taking people's time and talents, and you should be responding accordingly, are very important things to know going in.
Yeah, very interesting answers. It goes to show that there isn't I was expecting 5 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's no 5 steps, is there? So that's I think very important to know. Adrian, I'll let you take it from here.
So, Ruth, that was a really great segue to the question that I would like to ask next. And I think for the last half, we would like to open it up to be a little bit more conversational. So we would love for you all to be in conversation with one another, with us, and then we'll open it up for the audience for the last 30 minutes or so. But to your point, Ruth, even the best laid research plans sometimes can run into conflict. And I'd be really curious to hear, in your experience and some of the projects that you have worked on, when you do run into conflicts with community, whether it's about certain methodologies, about incentives, whatever that may be, what are some best practices for managing that conflict as it surfaces during your research projects? And if you all want, you can cut that microphone on and use it on the half end of the
Is it on?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I can start and be reflective and say that I have a tendency to be very stubborn. So I'm learning to not just simply walk away when things are maybe not going. So going to the next community advisory planning meeting as opposed to being like, y'all and we don't think about community the same way, I'm out, has been a good learning experience for me. And I think for me, I come to this work, I'm a Midwesterner, so I'm a pretty kind and friendly person, I think most people would say, and empathy matters a lot to me. And so bringing that same thing to even academic groups that we don't necessarily think of as, I don't think we treat our colleagues necessarily the same way we treat our neighbors sometimes. And so even just this is this article that I read or this toolkit that I found particularly important, and this is how I'm thinking about this work. Maybe you would like to look at this and see if you think it could inform our work as well. And then I think also, sometimes you have to make some compromises. So a lot of my work happens in correctional facilities. So there's conflict and tension all the time and different parties with different end goals. And I often find that if we can come to some compromise on how the work is going to be done, more is actually getting done. So it might not be exactly the paper that I want to write, but maybe there's actually a intervention that is implemented in a jail or a prison that actually, reduces harm caused by those spaces. So compromise is hard to learn, but I think it's rewarding and oftentimes worthwhile.
I'll build on that, just being flexible. So as Adrian mentioned, sometimes our plan A's don't always work out, but this is why, again, it's important to leverage the resources of your community stakeholders. So lean into them and ask them. Oftentimes, our plan A's don't work out because we have not consulted with those community members. So ask them questions. We've been in communities where, we've come with a questionnaire that's 20 to 30 questions, and our gatekeeper will say, well, this is too long, or these words will not quite be understood among your target population. So really leaning into the community and leveraging that resource.
Yeah, a few thoughts. I think one piece is recognizing that the conflict sometimes it's not an impediment to the work, it is the work. That by engaging with, I can remember on a project, somebody who was a community advocate, and she really took issue with some kind of language that we were using. And so seeing actually that conversation with her about why that language was offensive as advancing our work, not just advancing our relationship, but actually advancing our understanding of the phenomenon we were studying, right, is important. I sometimes, not always, but sometimes I see conflict as actually a symptom that, hey, we've got a relationship here because the person's willing to tell me, you know, because sometimes it's something they could have just walked away or just swallowed and harbored resentment. So those are some of my experiences around it. And when you were talking, there was something else that occurred to me, but I've forgotten it, so I'll pass it on to Charles.
Yeah, I think you all have mentioned most important things. I think to add, probably Ruth mentioned this empathy from the beginning, just understanding your positionality, that you sit in a university and that's the community and they may not see you as the same. It's not necessarily looking for equality, but basically equity, where they're heard, you're heard. And so I thought empathy is a critical thing. I think something that I've learned from ReCity is this design thinking from the beginning, involving people so that you can understand if there's going to be conflict, you can understand exactly where there could be conflict. Because in the design process, you'll hear things that are not necessarily happening in the process of you doing your study. You'll hear people say, I don't really like the idea that we'll go talk to those people. And if you don't listen to that, that's potentially going to be exactly where your conflict is going to occur. So having empathy and hearing them and having them hear that they're being heard is very crucial. And just going through that process can give you signals exactly where potential conflicts may occur, and creating ways that you can either overcome or compromise to try and get to where you need to be. Thanks.
I realized what the other thought was on my mind, and it goes back to what Ruth was saying about different conceptions of community engagement. As community engaged research has become more prevalent and more of a buzzword, I have found that there's more variety in what people mean by community engagement. And so sometimes the conflict actually isn't with the community, it's with the other people in the institution that you're working with, because they're coming in with a very different conception than you are. So I think, you know, having those conversations about, well, what is the goal of the community engagement, and then the form it takes, who we're partnering with and how should follow from that. But also, you know, sometimes you might need to walk away, right? Sometimes the values and the goals that you're bringing to the situation may just be very different than those of other folks. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think we never want this work to do harm to communities. And as beautiful as we think community engaged work can be, there are some times when conflict is just not very easily resolved, and pushing through may cause more harm than it does good. So knowing when to walk away can be a very mature and responsible decision to make. Something that also came up as you all were talking, and I'm going to be honest here, I'm going to interject a question that is not on our question sheet, but is a little bit about the role of power and kind of power sharing in community engaged research. And I'd be very curious to think about how you all, as researchers or practitioners who are going into communities, are thinking about power sharing and what steps you may put in place to make sure that community, whether it be community partners, community members, et cetera, feel empowered in the process, maybe a more kind of flat organizational structure rather than hierarchical. I'd be curious to know how you all think about that and what practices you all may implement in your own work.
I think it's evident, especially as soon as you introduce yourself as Dr. Muiruri, you already like shifted the room completely out. So if you say, I'm Charles, and please call me Charles, I could be a barber, but you wouldn't call me Barber Charles, you just call me Charles, right? So you could be a tailor, and you could just call me Charles. So clearing that out of the room early on is very crucial. And I think it's harder because they'll still come back and say, Dr. Charles, and you have to remind that I'm actually here to learn as opposed to here to direct. That's the reason why I'm coming to learn from the community. Otherwise, I would be sitting at Duke and writing papers of nothing. The reason why I'm here is because I want to learn. And so maybe positionality changes. It takes time for them to realize they're actually teaching you a lot more than you're teaching them. You've got the methodology, but your methods are useless if you don't necessarily have the data that you will get from the community. So a reminder all the time, I think, in my mind, is the positionality to make sure that you're communicating that you're here to learn and you're here to not make their life better. You also own up to the fact that you're making your life better by keeping a job at Duke. You'll be fired if you're not producing research. And so essentially just allowing yourself to use very practical ways of speaking about yourself and your need to be in this community and their need to be in the community to teach you and also for them to benefit. And being able to do that, I think that helps a lot. There is definitely places where a lot of trust has been eroded, and so damage has been done for a long time. And so that takes even a longer period for them to feel like you're genuine, that you're really, truly out here to learn. And so I think it takes a little bit more approaches that are more human than anything else. I feel like just if you show up as a human being saying, I have my flaws, I have my weaknesses, and I'm here to learn, maybe that can work. But I don't have the magic thinking, but I try that. Yeah. Kevin, what do you think? How do I do it? Yeah. I show up and I actually don't use these big words that nobody cares about. I just get down. And I also don't try and lose my accent. I keep my accent because I need to keep my positionality. I'm just owning out the fact that I'm very African and I'm here to learn. I don't know anything. And so I think that helps out. So maybe I don't know what others think.
All of that makes a lot of sense. And the thought that's on my mind thinking about this is that there's like formal power and there's informal power, right? That you can say, well, we're sharing power because this person is my co-investigator or because they're on the community advisory board and so forth. But there also are still things that can get in the way of the power that in theory is giving people actually being actualized. One of the things, for example, I mentioned that got members of the CIRI team here. One of the things they're really amazing at is the communication issue, because if you're talking jargon, right, you really are taking away people's power because they can't engage with what you're saying. They can't comment on what you're saying, right? And so they're really phenomenal at helping people learn to present information in a way that they can actually, really get real community feedback. One of the things that we've talked that always comes up when you talk about community engaged research is time. And I do think ideally you want to put a lot of time into planning discussions so that they really will yield actual dialogue. And sometimes that may mean doing a lot of prep with people beforehand, a lot. And I was a little surprised when I entered into the community engaged research world, having been a community organizer where we did tons of pre-meeting prep to make sure that the meeting would actually be fruitful and everybody would have a voice in it. And a lot of times that does seem to get skipped over in the research world because, again, we're so time pressured, So I think the more that we can figure out ways to build that in, the better.
I agree with what has been said. Another way to share power is to include the community stakeholders in at the very beginning. So make sure they have shared voice. I gave the example about, crafting the questionnaire and thinking about what kind of language to include. So really making sure that everyone's at the table from the very beginning. Shared voice.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer to the question, but I think in a lot of my work, we're constantly thinking about the balance between methodological purity and also engaging in relationships. And so how much, if I'm, interviewing you over a series of time, how much can I tell you about myself, despite the fact that that might help us have a more meaningful conversation, for you to know that I'm here because I've been here a lot, and offering things. So at the end of an interview at a coffee shop, am I or am I not allowed to offer to drive you to your home so that you don't have to take the bus? Or we are hopefully incentivizing people who are working with us, but is there a little extra something that we can give in that moment? And so certainly that comes from a place of power and resource. Maybe I have extra bus passes, or I have a car, or I just have a friend who might be hiring someone, and it's like, let me give you this phone number. And I know I'm constantly going back to our research team and saying, what does this look like? This isn't necessarily in the textbooks. This isn't how we think of things when we're thinking about sampling and bias and all of the things that our peer reviewers care about. But again, I think recognizing that your power and your resources might actually be able to help someone is useful for relationship building.
Can I just add to that? Thank you for mentioning incentives. So oftentimes we have in our mind as researchers and as project planners what types of incentives we want to offer communities without receiving their feedback. So perhaps, I don't know, a Walmart gift card might be more valued than something else. So really thinking about the incentives that you offer to the communities. How can it help them in meaningful ways?
I think that relates to a point that we kind of discussed this morning, particularly for those of us who are here at Duke and thinking about some institutional constraints. And there are a lot of constraints sometimes put in place by institutions, perhaps for good reasons, but that really can make that relationship tenuous, because there are very few things that we can do to show our gratitude and appreciation for the expertise that people offer us during the research process. So as we are nearing the end of our discussion, before we open it up to questions from the audience, I'd love to circle back to the theme of this conference, and I'd love to think about justice and equity a bit. How do you all see community engaged research practices as promoting justice and equity?
I will say rather limitedly, I work in quite institutionalized populations, and one step towards making those more equitable spaces is making them as community-like as they can be, despite the fact that they're the contained and the containers in all of these spaces. So there's been some really amazing work happening out of Urban Institute with Department of Adult Corrections that are actually collaborating and bringing correctional officers and incarcerated persons together and working with them to develop a research agenda that meets both of their needs. So a common example is, let's invest in rec facilities that both populations can use. And so, that's kind of great. Or playing video games together, or even just having, kind of more consensus sharing. So I think making these spaces that are inherently unequal and inherently stratified just slightly more community makes them slightly more equitable.
I would say it gives them a sense of voice. So oftentimes these communities aren't heard from the folks that can make the big changes. And community listening sessions is another strategy another strategy that we have implemented. So literally just sitting with a group of folks and listening to what they have to say. So it really gives them voice, and then that voice empowers them to be their own agents of change. So they are equipped with the confidence and the resources that they need to make those or start to affect change in their respective communities. So I would say really just giving them a voice is important.
One of the things we've talked a little bit about over the course of the day, right, is that you can think about community engagement in very different ways. You can think about more working with the people affected, more the grassroots community. You can also think about engaging with policy makers, decision makers, and so forth. And I think both of those can have the potential to help your work contribute to justice and equity in ways that people have talked about. Certainly think about the more grassroots involvement, voice sharing of resources. I mean, just fundamentally, right? Like, who's getting the money, who's getting paid to do the work. Coming up with research questions that are more relevant to actual needs and priorities of the community, and that have the potential to be translated into sustainable action that will benefit the community. And then, engaging more with policymakers and decision makers so that, the research that you're producing has a better chance, again, of being translated into action. But I do think it's important, and Kay Jowers kind of alluded to this morning, where she said you could talk about a spectrum where one side of the spectrum is manipulation. I mean, there's definitely a history of using techniques of figuring out who's the leader in the community, figuring out what the community wants, and then using that to actually take advantage of people. So we could argue whether that's true community engagement or not, but I do think it's important to be aware that whatever you want to call it, that happens.
I think, Michael, I agree very much with everyone who's spoken. For justice and equity, I think it's not a near-term achievement. It's a long-term achievement that we would like to get to where we're equitable, where we are not talking about underrepresentation, right? When we cannot talk about underrepresentation, I think that's where we start to get into that. How do we do that? I think as an institution, sometimes it occurs to me that it's very interesting that Duke hires 1 in every 2 people in a household in Durham. But at Duke, we try and think about a community, even though Duke is the community, right? And initiatives here that stem from our employees who are here working should be exactly what is a reflection of the community. But that doesn't happen because I think researchers sometimes get it wrong that there is some community out there in Durham when we are the community. So we are here as the community. And so whatever is not good for you that you're trying to achieve, that you're trying to intervene on, is potentially just around the corner from your home. And you're essentially part of that community. So in terms of achieving goals for justice and equity, I think it starts internally at an organization, internally with the people in the organization, to be recognized that they're actually the community. And there's not a community out there that we are trying to intervene on, that we are the individuals that make up that community. So I think it's kind of a lofty goal, but it has to take a different way of thinking, I think, from an organization. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for the wisdom that you shared with us today. We're looking forward to audience questions. So we have about half an hour or so. So any questions that you all may have for the panel, I will be down shortly, and there will be a mic going around for anyone who wants to speak.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the thoughts. I learned a lot. I want to go back to the question about power and thinking about communities. There are divisions and factions and groups within communities, right? They're not monoliths of themselves, just like universities aren't. And when we balance that reality with the need to build long-term relationships and have liaisons and have people that act as sort of facilitators between researchers and communities, I wonder about the power dynamics there. Who are we empowering? Who are we disempowering? And I know that's a tricky question, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or guidance or best practices associated with that. How do we avoid over-empowering or disempowering in that practice of building relationships?
I had not thought about that until now. The only thing that comes to mind at the moment is accountability. But then again, it begs the question, who is holding both the liaison and the university partner accountable? They can hold each other accountable, but I think there also has to be perhaps some sort of outside entity holding the two accountable. But that's a really, really great question that I will give further thought to. I don't know if others have thoughts.
One of the things I've definitely experienced is power imbalances in a community advisory board. And one of the things that has made me sensitive to is first of all, really thinking about who you're choosing to be on there and who will really be able to hold their own, but also capacity building, also working with individuals to make sure that, again, that they're going into that meeting as prepared as the next person. And just because the next person is a member of the community who maybe has a little more experience in this area, more knowledge or whatever, that they also, are able to hold their own. Also also making sure a lot of times that there isn't just one person of a particular type, in the room, because I think that can make it very hard to speak up. But yeah, there are sort of such, basic power issues that I think sometimes, there are conflicts sometimes within the community, and sort of being aware of those and being intentional about trying to do things in a way that gets all those voices, not just at the table, but with equal ability to speak up.
I think it's also a fine line between empowering and tokenizing. So it's also when you are choosing who you are going to give this kind of responsibility or elevated access to the research to make sure that your team understands what that expertise is, and to make sure that your community advisor, your members, or your project consultant doesn't ever have to feel like they're not really a part of the team, or that like there's a very specific reason that they're there, or that you want them there to validate, but you don't actually want their input or anything. So I think that's also super important.
I agree. That's a very good question and very complex. I think in my experience was in Tanzania, we had a community advisory group, and we're interested in understanding substance abuse amongst people living with HIV, and we asked the doctors in the room, and how much of substance abuse do you see? And the doctors go, a little bit of marijuana here and there, but not really. And a community member stood up and said, you know nothing about this. I can tell you, if you walk in our neighborhoods and you see a shoe on the power lines, walk 10 rows of houses, and that's where the drugs are. And kids up to 3 years old are actually consuming it. It became very steamy in the space. And what that meeting ended up becoming is that we want to have a youth CAB, a youth community advisory group. We don't want to talk with these older people. They called us older people, but is that these older people really don't understand what the community is actually. So they ended up forming a community advisory group for the youth, for the youth to speak about themselves. And so that conflict led to something that potentially was now becoming something that kind of represents the community. There were these conflicts, and whatever came from this CAB had to be vetted by this CAB, and this CAB had to vet whatever was coming up. And somehow that was bringing some sense of harmony. But down the road that those two clubs have existed by themselves and really driving the different research questions that come up. So that conflict was good, but it was quite telling of how much what you pointed out can be the case. The person who speaks about something may not necessarily know anything about it. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robin. I'm a PhD student at the Nicholas School. And we've talked a lot today about both sort of the meaning of equity being like contingent and contextual and changing for different people, and the need to ensure that, you know, we're working in service of communities' priorities and not our own as a researcher. But I'm curious about sort of, you know, communities have competing priorities as well. And I encountered this a lot in my dissertation work where everyone I'm working with in my community engagement wants really different things and are advocating for really different outcomes. And in some ways, the decisions I make about how I carry out the research and present it become taking a side in that in some way. And so I'm curious what you think about just the role of the researcher in navigating competing priorities and, you know, choosing those that you elevate and those that you don't.
So one thing I've not disclosed, my undergraduate is in computer science and math, and somehow I'm able to deal with people. It's interesting. That question, I actually thought about that question, and from a mathematics, from a statistical point of view, they peer reviewers tell you have to include all the variables. You cannot exclude specific variables in your model, right? If you left race, they'll tell you this model does not explain anything, right? So your experience in community engagement, if you think statistically from a statistical point of view, is exactly what is happening. The community has priorities, and you as a statistician, you are prioritizing what's in there. You're basically saying, I'm gonna include this in the model, and I'm not gonna include this because I don't think it is. So I think as you're engaging the community, somehow that's happening. And so it's not by accident that that's happening, that there's going to be priority for everyone. And so, again, I think about KJ and his work at ReCity. ReCity is, I think, has 25 different organizations. They are focusing on education. They are focusing on hunger. They are focusing on transport. So as you walk in, if you're interested in education, that space has someone else dealing with something else. And so maybe that's the structure that, you know, embedding your work, not necessarily your work, but those demands could be, here's a resource, or here's an organization that can help you guys with, please help me get my dissertation work done. At the same time, try to do that. So that's how I've been thinking about it, because that's the biggest challenge, I think, that you face in community engagement. A story out of Peru last year, Bill Pan, who's your mentor, has a great malaria detection, malaria response. It kind of detects when the outbreaks of malaria will show up. So it showed up with this really interesting tool in the Amazon jungle, and the community stayed there. If you can predict malaria, can you predict the rain? Because the rain is what we need to plant our crops, and so you can predict malaria, great, but can you predict when it's gonna rain? Because that's what we need. It's either we die of hunger or we die of malaria. So if you can predict rain, that would be really cool. So that's the thing, it's kind of the same challenges. Our interest in science or interest in the space may not necessarily fit what the community does. But maybe getting into a collective, a space, people who are actually working in other places and bring them on board to your work can be quite helpful.
I do think it's important at the beginning to decide how you're going to make decisions. And I think for the most part, most of the situations I've been in, we've been able to come to consensus, and that's how we've made decisions. But we have had a fallback, you know, sometimes that we might have to take a vote. For example, I think I'm thinking about, your question is a really good one, and it's making me think about different situations I've been in. And one situation where we really just fell apart because we couldn't agree what to do. And I think what might have differentiated that situation was we didn't have resources. We were trying to stay together and keep working together, but we didn't have any more money. I think it can be easier, right, when everybody's got a reason to make it work and try to work it out so that they can work together and all benefit. But yeah, I do think figuring out that process beforehand is helpful.
I agree with my colleagues, and just to add perhaps a needs assessment, or just being flexible. So going in with one idea, but understanding that, you may have to pivot depending on other needs that arise in the community.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly, like the willingness to be humble and the willingness to acknowledge that the work is never going to be perfect. The work's never going to make everyone happy. And, all right, this is how this project or initiative went. The next one, let's try and bring your ideas to the forefront. Let's try and have you lead the initial meetings of things. But certainly having a backbone, having your beliefs, doing work you believe in, but like acknowledging that like everything is going to be imperfect and not hiding from that, I think is important.
Thank you so much. My name is Jules. I'm a master's student in pop health at Duke. I wanted to talk about something that was not talked about in this session, about funding. And we talked about having patience because partnerships takes time, and as a colleague of mine just said, you have to navigate different priorities, different power balances, and sometimes as a researcher you have also conflicting deadlines, reporting, funding to funders, because as we know, all of us survive on funders. We need to get money, and you also have to report about it. Sometimes researchers are criticized of overlooking those power balances or priorities, not because they intend to, but because they have to. They're accountable to. They need to keep moving. You can't do with everything. What are your thoughts about it, and how do you see it interfering with partnerships and trust in the community? Because you also have to think about it. Yeah, thank you.
So do you want me to answer you as a master's student, or do you want me to answer you as a researcher? Because a master's student needs to finish their education, right? Right? Or doctorate has to finish and get a job, right? So that probably may take a different thing. And I think for you as a master's student, I would urge that if you're going to the community, your mentor has to be in the community. Otherwise, it takes time, as you pointed out. So if your mentor is not in the community and you're trying to get in the community, you probably are not going to graduate, or you'll have to pivot. And I'm working with you, so don't go to the community before you talk to me. So as a researcher, I think it's a whole different thing. I'm hoping that researchers and institutions can think about, if you're getting in community engagement, I don't know, maybe Mina can say something about that. In the recruitment process, somebody walks in and says they want to do community engaged work, and we know how much and how long it takes. Are negotiations to be in place where instead of you spending the first 3 years trying to get your research up, is the first 3 years of your work going to be building that trust and building that community? Is that something that at the chair's level should be thought about? Or would you advocate for that if you don't do that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I came in sideways. I came in to be a program evaluator for the Division of Community Health, so they weren't expecting me to have like an NIH-funded career, and then I surprised them like 5 years in by applying for an NIH grant. But if you do really need to understand what the expectations are, and you do need to negotiate that, and it definitely needs to be recognized that it's a different kind of career. The funding sources may be different, the timeline, the deliverables, and all of that, and so I think that does need to be negotiation. There's no doubt that the funders' timelines really aren't really right for doing what we're trying to do, and so I think, again, one thing I would say in response to that is diversifying your portfolio, because different funders are looking for different kinds of things, and you can maybe kind of put together what you want to do in that way. Also, continuing to connect with people even when you don't have funding, they're in small ways possibly. They don't have to be big. And then the other issue is sometimes, having to fight some institutional battles about how funding is used. I mean, I can remember, having to convince legal counsel at Duke that it was okay to pay people for being community partners, not research subjects. And I mean, now that's understood, but like at that time, that was just crazy. And just having to sometimes be aware of those, the need to fight those battles.
I'm going to pass the mic. I agree with what's been said.
I'll just add quickly, I think as the researcher, when you're approaching a potential community partner, having a contingency plan, or oftentimes you're going and saying, I would like you to be my community partner on this grant I'm applying for, and it'll be great when Arnold Ventures gives us $50 billion and we can save the world together. And they get really excited and they're working with you on the grant proposal process and they're offering you access to their resources and their communities to serve. Well, then that grant doesn't come through and you say, all right, on to the next. I think having a contingency plan and saying, if this funding doesn't come through, we'd like to, move to this avenue, or this is the institutional support I can offer, or, let's modify, how scalable can these kind of interventions be? Because I think sometimes we come in and we offer community partners what we can't ultimately give them, and we've taken a lot of their time and we've given them something to get really excited about and then just kind of taken that away from them. So, and it's for us, it's well, I got to apply for the next grant. I need to move on. So thinking about how that relationship can be long-term, even if the initial funding plan or goal or amount isn't received.
Hi, everyone. Liliana Marin. Hi, Mina. I worked with her in the past. I work with the American Heart Association. I'm their community impact director. And we have talked about things best practices prior to research, during research. But my question is more what do we do once you publish that data? Are we working towards simplifying that information to make sure that the community understands what they actually went through?
Excellent question. I have an example of that. So you heard me mention community listening sessions that we conducted, and we took all of that data and did something really novel. We hired a graphic artist. So she took all of the information from the recordings and the transcriptions and created a visual that summarized what came about from those community listening sessions. And then we brought those same participants back and did what we call community walks, or data walks rather. And they took the information in based on that graphic, and we asked them, does this accurately reflect what it was that came up in those listening sessions? And they would say yes or no. But bringing that data, bringing that information back to the very same community that you got it from is very, very important. And we have found that to be important in our work as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. And along the lines of what Nina was just talking about, I'll put in another plug, not for are part of the CTSI, but the Recruitment Innovation Center, they will actually, we're really trying to emphasize now return of results to research participants in a way that's meaningful. And they will actually help you put together like a beautiful document that has visuals and, you know, that really does that well. But the other piece, of course, is not just the participants, but the community. So planning ahead that there will be some kind of community forum and working with your community partners to figure out what is the best way to get this information back, again, in an actual meaningful way. And we've done some really fun things, you know, kind of party style kind of things with that. I guess the other thing that I would want to also mention in this regard is that sometimes it's about getting information back, but also, you know, and so that individuals can use it or groups can use it. But sometimes it's also about really working with people to figure out what's this information good for and what should we be doing now that we have this information? Like, what's the next step? And again, I think that's a piece that funders traditionally don't, I mean, right? For them, it's done when you publish the results. So, you know, thinking about that and how can you work that in a way that they're going to give you the funding for that. And again, engaging with the right people from the beginning who will help you do that and think about that.
Yeah, I think I agree with everyone. What I've done lately is one of my grants, I included patient investigators. So they became investigators on the study. We published the work together, so they were co-authors on the paper. And then we helped them create this they said, I understand it. And I can talk about what we did. And I can say it in my own words. And so we sent them back to the CAB and the community for them to present. And they were out there, I showed up with my PowerPoint slides. I say, Charles, how do you click this? Just give me one slide. Let me show you this one slide. This is exactly what we did, and this is exactly what people think is important. So having them really not only participate from the beginning, have them, you know, they didn't engage in data analysis, but the interpretation of the data and the discussion of the data, they were very crucial in that part of the manuscript writing. When we wrote them and we said, how would you say this back to your colleagues? And say, oh, I can't tell you. I call my granddaughter and she thinks I'm the smartest person around. I was like, that's cool, because then you can speak about it. You can say it in your own words. And so I think that's probably powerful. It's not easy, especially if you're working in this maybe big data stuff. But I can tell you can break it down to the lowest common. And if a young sixth grader can understand it, I think you've met your goal, and have them now speak about it instead of you standing and speaking about it. Thank you. And now I've told them, now that you've published, you probably want to look for a job and tell people you know stuff, you know.
I still heard some ringing, so I'm not sure the mic thing helped. But my question, I wanted to just hear a few more practical experiences around compensation for community partners. And in general, I think we all agree we want to compensate people for their time. And the more participatory you are on the spectrum of community engagement, the more time and energy you're really demanding of people. But I've also seen instances where especially, Mina, as you were saying, when you start from a place of relationship, how sometimes introducing money into those relationships can commodify that relationship in a way that kind of changes the relationship. And I think it also introduces new questions of why is this person paid and not these, and how much. And so based on your experiences, I just wanted to hear what are either some principles or some best practices around compensation for community partners, recognizing how important that piece is.
Lately, we have written that person into our grants. So if we can think about that ahead of time, we write in monies for that community liaison. It hasn't really been an issue in terms of modifying the relationship for us, but I can see how that might happen. But time is such a valuable asset, and we want to make sure that we're compensating folks for both their time, their knowledge, and wisdom that they're bringing to the table. I'll let others chime in about other types or sources of compensation.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. I think my lived experience is we're often proposing incentives to a group or an organization that's not familiar with that, and so they don't know what that process is going to look like, and so there's a tendency to say, no, we don't want to do that. That sounds difficult, like, oh, we're going to have to get HR involved, or we're going to have to go up the levels, and not shying away from that first initial no, and saying, like, well, would you mind if I had the conversation with the person that you're scared might be the gatekeeper? And I can play the ignorant, like, I'm just here asking questions. But yeah, I think if you believe in incentives, if you believe in compensating people for their time and labor, like, not just holding that as a belief, but really putting in that extra effort to see that to fruition, because it is something that a lot of people don't know how to think about. And, you know, I've been in plenty of instances where I say, we would love to pay you. We're so grateful for you to have you here, but we just couldn't, but, you know, thank you. Or we couldn't pay you for your time, but here's some Domino's pizza. Like, pizza's great, but it's like, I don't get paid in pizza, and I don't think we should pay others in pizza either. So having that bravery and having that conviction, and sometimes, like, being willing to be the person who figures out the process. I know many of us have probably done work at Duke, and it's I've worked in projects on the medical side, and it's very confusing how we pay people and why there are Duke cards, and sometimes we need SSN and sometimes we don't, and it's very complicated. But being willing to be the person, like, I'll handle this. Like, I will have these conversations. I will fill out the daunting paperwork. And then on the, Dr. Smith mentioned this earlier, but asking your community how they want to be compensated. So I know for us, it's very easy on our group to give you an Amazon gift card, but, like, I don't use Amazon, so why am I expecting that the people I'm working with want to use Amazon? So yeah, being willing to be the person that makes this kind of challenging thing happen is a way to get it done.
Thank you for speaking about compensation and incentives. So when I mentioned writing it into the grant, that was above and beyond the incentives for the participants. We actually write in a consultation fee for that community partner into the grant.
Yeah, there's so much to say here, and I work with a group of people who right now we've been trying to get Duke to kind of standardize the way that they do this and streamline the paperwork, and it is really problematic. But two things occur to me. One is, again, you work with really different kinds of people, and some people may have an hourly rate, you know, already, right? Because they've been for example, a patient advocate, you know, on a lot of committees. And so Cindy and I have been working on a proposal where there's a patient advocate who's part of the study team, and, you know, lucky for us, has a standardized rate, which certainly makes it easier and less having to get into that weird, like, you know, bringing money into the relationship area. I do think, you know, when maybe it's not as cut and dry as that, still trying to approach it as much as possible as, like, this is part of the process, right? And this is not about me and you, this is about the process. I do think we should probably, you know, other people, sometimes I find that community folks don't expect as much as they should expect. And so I do think that part of what we should be doing, those of us in the kind of the community engagement capacity building field, is working with community folks about, here's what you can expect and here's what you can, you know, and one of the things you should expect is that you're there when the conversation about budget happens, and that you're, you know, and that you get to say your piece about how much you think you need to be compensated for. And so I think we need to, I think we need to help people get to where they can speak up for themselves in that regard.
Thank you. Very, very good question. And I think I like your idea, Mina. I think institutionalizing it, making it known across the board, because what happens is if I'm on Mina's study, Mina pays me $50. You get to Nina's, and she pays you $100. And all of a sudden, when I call you because I paid you $50, you won't pick up my phone, right? And so you've now created a heterogeneity among participants and communities. And now Nina shows up because she's cheap. Nobody wants to work with her, right? Nina is cheap. Don't work with her, right? Isn't it? Right? Have you heard? Communities actually say that. Forget Charles. He's cheap. He doesn't pay. But I think if you institutionalize it and make it known that across the board, if an IRB is coming in, if a study is coming in, we want to look at, are we paying everybody? Why is there heterogeneity around it? In Tanzania, we've been able to do that at the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center. And if you walk in, if the IRB approves it, it's approved on a standard rate. Therefore, the community knows to what extent that is helpful. And that data is from the community for how much they should be paid for. If you're cheap and your grant can pay for that, find new money, or if you've got enough money, more than that money, maybe keep it to yourself. Keep what is to be paid by that community. So institutionalizing this is going to be maybe the solution to that heterogeneity.
Yeah, I like that example, and it goes back to the question about promoting equity, so that there's a way to do that. By making sure that we are being equitable in the ways that we compensate communities.
And you're not cheap.
I'm not cheap.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Imad. I'm a student at Carolyn class. This is very insightful and remind me of a lot of work I was doing with the community. And then, for example, it's not about compensation. Some culture, it's not about also money. Like we were trying to involve women. We will try to coordinate with, collaborate with other organizations, so the women can have, their children can have a space, or if other thing. But my question is, how, when you're working with communities not English language speaking, when you're trying to extract that data or knowledge, how you give back, how you democratize knowledge, how you translate that language research paper or academic paper to the people on the ground.
Okay. The first idea, the first experience that I've had with that comes to my mind is I did my dissertation research in Venezuela. And so my Spanish was a lot better then than it is now because I was there for a whole year. But I asked people I want to give something back to this one particular organization, especially that had just really helped me a lot in doing my research. And, they basically said, yeah, could you write us a report in Spanish about, what you found, and in particular what you found that was relevant to our organization. And so I did that, and I had somebody proofread it for me and edit it for me. And so, as we've talked about today, that's not the kind of thing that goes on your resume, right? And it takes time, and nobody at the institution rewards you for it, but you should be doing it, right, to the best of your ability. So that's one example I have.
Yeah, so, and I'm going to look at my other student, Joshua. Joshua is from Ghana. He's about to go to Tanzania where they speak Kiswahili. The requirement for the IRB is that you have to forward translate your English, and someone else has to back translate that back. So forward translate to Kiswahili, and then back from Kiswahili to English, that IRB process. So at that point, you'll figure out what is being lost in this case. Then when it comes to publications, of course, you will publish in English journals, but in terms of bringing it back to the community, there has to be that other process again of forward translation and then back translation so that it makes sense for the people you served. That piece, the last piece, doesn't happen mostly. And it's in the offices of faculty that you'll find this data. And so that piece has not happened, but the community advisory group has really insisted that that is a piece of what should be brought back, and should be brought back. If you interviewed people in their language, it should be brought back in the language that they actually were able to be interviewed, so that it makes sense for them, for the questions they were able to ask. So it's a practice. Nobody pays for that, and that's the tricky part. But I think for the most part, new grants are requiring that you write about your dissemination plan and how you will actually reach it back. And hopefully people are doing it, but it's an important step.